All right, the one remaining problem with our selection is that it fails to account for these soft feathers right here. And the reason that the feathers at the top of the wing and down here in the tail as well are so very soft is because the bird is in motion. And so what we want to do is retain all of that softness. And we can do so by essentially roughing up the edges using the smudge tool. So the first step is to switch back to the quick mask mode, either by clicking on its icon at the bottom of the toolbox or just pressing the Q key. And see what I'm talking about right here? We have these wonderful high contrast edges that work great for the face and the belly and so forth. They even work well for these tail feathers down here, but they don't work at all for these left-hand feathers, nor do they work for the feathers in the wing. And so you might figure what we want to do at this point is go ahead and increase the size of the brush a little bit by pressing the right bracket key, and then right-click inside the image and crank that hardness value down to 0. And while that might on occasion work out for you, there's an easier way to work. And that way is the smudge tool. And so you can get to the smudge tool by clicking and holding on the blur tool, the one that looks like a droplet, and then choosing the smudge tool from the flyout menu. And then I'm going to increase the size of my cursor fairly dramatically here to, let's say, 150 pixels, as you can see on the left side of the options bar. And if I right-click inside the image, you'll see that the hardness by default is set to 0%. That is what we want for this tool. And then notice how it works. You just basically drag in order to smear things around, which isn't always what you want when you're retouching a full color image. But again, it's great for creating soft transitions in a mask. Now, I don't necessarily want to go that far, so I'll press Control-Z or Command-Z on the Mac in order to undo that change. And I'll start just by smearing a very little bit. Notice how small my smears are. And you can also just kind of wiggle back and forth in order to introduce more blurriness into a section. And I'll go ahead and shake these guys around a little bit as well, and I'll drag them back and forth. Now I want to be a little more exacting by reducing the size of my cursor, which I'm doing by pressing the left bracket key, and then I'll just smear these areas out to the real tips of the wings, and I'll smear this guy a little bit in and then back outward here. It appears to me that the wing goes out a little bit more up here at the top, and it also kind of goes upward. Can you see that? So I'll go ahead and increase the size of my cursor and just drag upwards. So very tiny modifications, very small brush strokes are what you're looking for. Also notice that the strength value here is set to 50%. If I were to crank that up all the way to 100%, I would end up with an effect like this. So you can see I'm just basically moving pixels around at this point, which is not what I want. So a strength of 50% generally works great. And I can get that, by the way, because the tool is selected, I can just tap the 5 key in order to reduce that value like so. And now I'm going to reduce the size of my cursor, and I'll paint in like that and then just a little bit out. I'm just trying to follow the natural edges of these wings as much as I can. And then down at this region, I just know that we need to shake things up a little. So I'll just kind of wiggle back and forth here in order to introduce a little bit of motion blur. And that's the great thing about it. You do have a different kind of blur that you can add using the blur tool that will allow you just to blur transitions and nothing more. But I really am trying to create a kind of motion blur, which is where the smudge tool becomes so useful. All right, now I'll reduce the size of my cursor and paint up like that. And then let's go ahead and see what else we have in the way of these tail feathers down here. Notice, if you will, if I turn the quick mask off for just a moment so we can see the full color image, we do have this weird sort of rounded detail. So that is actually part of our bird. And it's represented here inside of our mask. But this edge right there needs to come farther up, and this one needs to come farther down. So I'll go ahead and paint these guys outward like so. And then I figure this area should just be softer. And so I'll just kind of wiggle the brush back and forth a little bit in order to introduce that motion blur down here as well, I think. And that should probably do it. And then the final place where we've got these wispy little details right here is underneath the foot, these talons. And so I'll just go ahead and wiggle that up and down. We don't need to get every single little bird feather, every bit of down, for example, but I would like to make these areas look a little softer by wiggling them back and forth. And now I'll just go ahead and zoom out here in order to take in the changes. And notice we now have some very nice soft transitions. And that's one of the great things about working in the quick mask mode. It is unique among the starter selection tools in allowing you to mix sharp edges with soft ones, which is really the key to selecting natural image elements. And now I'll go ahead and save my changes by creating a copy of my quick mask, which I can do by dragging the quick mask and dropping it on the little page icon at the bottom of the channels panel. And I'll go ahead and call this Motion Blur Wings. And then I'll press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac to accept that change. I'll switch back to the RGB image up here at the top of the channels panel, and I'll press the Q key in order to exit the quick mask mode and restore my marching ant style selection outline. And that is how you introduce naturalistic motion blur into a selection outline using the smudge tool in the quick mask mode.